So there's a whole system of sort of perverted incentives that cause, imaginary threats to become supposedly real threats. And,
Right.
lots of people benefit. The more we can educate the average citizen of Canada, United States, of the world for that matter, about the facts of climate and other science for that matter, the better off we will be. It will make them less susceptible to hucksters who prey on their ignorance. But the way much of science is going now, it's like, like savage witch doctors. This is what the witch doctor tells you. All the witch doctors agree, and so that's what the truth is. But of course, that's not science at all.
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense, and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
Well, the facts are that there is a vigorous scientific debate going on about climate change, despite what so many politicians or what you might hear in the media. Frankly, the public is unaware of this intense debate, and it's a debate that is going on among scientists. Well, I'm delighted to welcome our guest, Dr. William Happer, a preeminent physicist and scientist known around the world, that can give us a little bit more sense of what's happening in this scientific debate that you may never hear about. So Dr. Happer is Professor Emeritus at Princeton University. He's a specialist in modern optics, optical and radio frequency. Dr. Happer has served in numerous U.S. administrations at a senior leadership level, including as Director of Energy Research under the Bush administration on fusion, environmental and climate science, the Human Genome Project, among others. And he also served for 1 year as a Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director of Emerging Technologies in the National Security Council in 2018. A warm welcome, Dr. Happer.
Thank you, David.
Well, it's incredible to talk with you, Dr. Happer. I really am honored that you could join us at this discussion. And I do want to remind our audience to please pose their questions in the chat. You're welcome to do that. But I would like to set the stage because we've got a lot to cover in today's far-reaching discussion. But I want to talk to you first about yourself and science. So Dr. Happer, you're a scientist. Can you help us understand what kind of scientist you are?
Well, David, I was trained as a nuclear physicist, and so I know sort of a lot about quantum mechanics and the things that go with nuclear physics. I've done a lot of work with lasers and atomic physics and a fair amount of atmospheric physics too. I'm probably best known for having invented the sodium guide star, which is used by many astronomical observatories today, on ground-based observatories, to measure atmospheric properties and remove their effects on how well the telescope is able to see stars and galaxies. And so I've had a fairly broad career, and I know a lot about physics and chemistry, and actually quite a lot about climate. I would guess I know as much as most climate scientists do, maybe
Very
more.
good. Okay, so I want to ask you what some may think is a funny question, and that is there really such a thing as climate science?
Well, it brings to mind my friend, the John Nash, who was the subject of the movie A Beautiful Mind, and he had schizophrenia, and so he was really out of action for many years, for decades, but he gradually got better as he grew older, and finally the Nobel Prize Committee awarded him the Nobel Prize in economics or something, for his invention of game theory, which is very important in economics. And They were a little nervous. I remember they sent over a team from Sweden to ask his friends, I was one of them, whether he would embarrass them if they awarded the prize, because reporters would come and talk to him, and he might say
Fascinating.
something that would be just more than they could take. And we all reassured them that, yeah, he's eccentric, but he won't embarrass you terribly. So sure enough, when the prize was announced, there was a flurry of activity. Reporters showed up at Princeton, and a young woman reporter shoved a microphone in front of his in front of his face and said, "Well, you know, Dr. Nash, what did you think when you heard that you had gotten the Nobel Prize?" And so there was a long silence while you could see the wheels turning, and she said, "Well, I actually thought it was more money." Then the reporter didn't expect this, and she had to think of something else to say. So she said, "Well, Dr. Nash, what do you think of social sciences and other sciences outside of mathematics and physics and chemistry, the traditional ones, gender science, for example?" And again, there was this long silence. You could see the wheels turning. And he says, "Well, if the name has science in it, it's not science," right?
Okay.
So
All
anyway,
right. So are you saying that climate science is a bit like gender studies? Is this what you're saying, Dr. Happer? Wow. Okay. Well, that might be a revelation for some people. I know it is for me a little bit.
Yeah,
But I guess the humbling thing about this is if we're looking at the prediction of climate,
yeah.
and this is probably the understatement of the year, it is terribly complex, is it not?
It's very complex. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, there's a reason for that. It's the interaction of the atmosphere and the ocean. Both of them are fluids, and fluids are notoriously difficult to predict and to work with. And so it's no wonder that it's a difficult field. Doesn't mean you
Hmm.
should give up, but you shouldn't
Right.
claim more than you can do with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you were to rapidly summarize just some of the key variables, I mean, we have obvious things like the sun to what else do we have? Water vapor. Do clouds matter, Dr. Happer?
Well, the Earth's climate is dominated by the sun. We get all of the energy that keeps us warm from the sun. There's maybe a part per thousand that comes from geothermal heat coming up from the interior of the Earth, but that's trivial.
Hmm.
So we're completely dependent on the sun. I don't know if you've ever been in a solar eclipse, but a total eclipse, one of the first things you notice is that it really gets cold. If it's a clear day,
Hmm. Hmm.
yeah, you're kind of shivering by the time that the eclipse is over. And so, for just those brief few minutes that the sun is eclipsed, the Earth cools very rapidly. In blue skies, especially. So the sun provides heat, and you've got to get rid of that heat, or the Earth would overheat. And so we get rid of the heat by radiating heat back into empty space. Space is nice and cold, and so you can radiate all the infrared you like and come to an equilibrium temperature. So Earth has been doing that from the beginning. It's
Hmm.
heated by the sun and it cools off by radiating to space. Now, that radiation to space comes partly from the surface and partly from clouds radiating to space, and partly from greenhouse gases, especially in clear skies when there are no clouds around. And so these three things, the surface, the clouds, and gases, are re-radiating solar heat back into space. And greenhouse gases make it a little bit harder to re-radiate because they radiate typically at higher altitudes where it's cooler. And we should be grateful for that because, if you look at what the Earth's temperature would be like, it would be like Winnipeg winter, all year round
Hmm.
without water
Hmm.
vapor and carbon dioxide. So thank goodness for greenhouse gases.
Exactly.
Uh,
So when we think about climate change, often carbon dioxide
yeah,
is fingered as this extraordinary gas that is kind of at the cause of virtually all our concerns, that climate change becomes an existentialist threat.
Yeah,
Is that a fair
of
comment?
course, that's complete nonsense. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas and it causes some warming, but water vapor is much more important. And if you include clouds plus water vapor, water in both forms completely dominates the greenhouse effect of the Earth. Carbon dioxide is a runner up. So
Okay.
without clouds, carbon dioxide might be about a third of the greenhouse effect. Two-thirds would be
Okay.
water vapor. And if you add clouds, then water just completely overwhelms CO2.
Okay, so just to clarify that again, so I can hear senior fellow from Frontier, Dr. Patrick Moore, one of the co-founders of Greenpeace,
Right.
saying, yes, carbon dioxide is actually not a pollutant. It's actually vital for life around the Earth. So you'd agree with that thesis that carbon dioxide is actually important?
Yes, absolutely. Patrick Moore couldn't be more correct about that. And the Earth really lives on carbon dioxide.
Hmm.
You and I are sitting here breathing out carbon dioxide because that we need the carbon to live, in the form of, food, proteins and carbohydrates, fats, but they're all made of carbon. And they,
Hmm.
not very long ago, they were all carbon dioxide in the air that was captured by, you know, cornfields or, pastures
Wow.
and, eventually passed on to us.
Okay.
We,
But this
we
this
feel
whole
pretty
thesis
well.
about carbon dioxide then, are you concerned about the environment? Like, are you somehow being reckless in your statements about carbon dioxide? Like, how are we then in this existential crisis? We hear this all the time. In Canada, we even have what's it called? It used to be called Environment Canada,
Uh-huh,
has been renamed as Climate Change Canada
uh-huh.
to emphasize that we've got to be focused on this whole existential threat. What is going on here? Why is the public debate saying that we are headed over a cliff when in fact, from a scientific point of view, you're saying, no, that's not true. And that there's actually a scientific debate then with among scientists about what's happening with our climate, because climate is always changing, is it not?
Yes, of course. Well, look, for the last, you know, 40, 50 years, climate has warmed a little bit. It's been about a tenth of a degree per decade, which is much, much less than the predictions of, you know, the climate establishment. In fact, I wrote one of the first papers on this back in the 80s, and I got it wrong too. I predicted two or three times more warming than we've actually observed. I've learned more since then, so I think I understand what was wrong.
Wow.
But
So you actually make mistakes as everybody does.
everybody makes mistakes, of course.
Okay. Wow. So we have a lot of politicians, a lot of the media, we have a lot of even celebrities, actors out there talking about the existential nature of climate change. So is it just because it's popular to talk in that language? Is it used as a rationale to make a lot of policy changes? What's going on here? What's your thesis on this?
Well, it's hard to know. I think there are many reasons. There are sincere people who have been misled. They're
Mm,
not terribly strong scientifically, they're not numerate, and so it's very hard for them to come to their own conclusion. And so all they hear since childhood is there's this climate emergency. And, we have short lives, so we can't remember what our grandfathers saw or our great grandfathers, but
mhm,
who saw more or less the same climate as we have, although it was a little bit cooler because we were coming out of the little ice age in the 1800s. But so they're sincere people who've just been misled. And then
mhm,
there have been opportunists who've made a lot of money, from pushing sustainable energy, and they get chairs at universities and you know prizes, Nobel prizes, even for
mhm.
saving humanities. it's all nonsense. They're not saving
Yeah.
anybody. Uh, and then there are there are just so many motives. None of them are quite the same.
Oh, yes, right. And what's interesting, I think, in the last few months, we've learned a lot about what we've long time suspected, is that there's quite a network of government agencies that have really worked hard to push a certain narrative regarding climate for whatever reason,
Right.
and even censor it. And I think that most recently within the Twitter files, and I
Right.
encourage people to look at them with an open mind,
Yeah.
it's almost disturbing how, when we need, in fact, open debate and discussion regarding all kinds of issues, it's clear that there's a very significant network pushing a only one-sided narrative. Did that surprise you to learn of that? I mean, you've been intimately involved at the highest level of the
Yeah.
U.S. government. Did that surprise you?
No, I mean, 1991, when I was director of energy research, that's 20 years, 30 years now, a little more than 30 years ago, that we were still pushing climate alarmism. I was a little bit guilty myself because if I pushed it, my budget would be bigger the next year. And so I was infected with the same problem, as it says in the scriptures, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also.
Hmm.
That's
Interesting.
true of scientific funding, so the best way to get funding is to invent a threat, and then Congress will give you money to address the threat, and then you have to hire people to help you address the threat, and then since you have more people working for you in Washington, that means your salary goes up. So there's a whole uh, system of sort of perverted incentives that cause, imaginary threats to become supposedly real threats. And,
Right.
lots of people benefit, and the
Hmm.
average person is screwed.
Okay, wow. So, given this kind of strange dichotomy, we've got this kind of public debate going on, Dr. Happer. We've learned about that and how, in your opinion, that's really not based on the science. But meanwhile, there's real scientists such as yourself that are debating about the climate. So, can we talk a little bit more about that and what the nature of that debate is about?
Well, I think the heart of the debate is how much feedback is there from direct effects of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, methane or nitrous oxide? How much feedback is there that would amplify the direct effects or attenuate it? So, right from the beginning, it was clear that the direct effects of carbon dioxide weren't big enough to worry anyone. One of the very first uh, environmental alarmist was Steve Schneider. I always admired him because he was very straightforward and quite honest in what he said. But he started out as a global cooling alarmist. This was back around 1970, 71, and indeed, the climate was getting colder then. I remember that period. I lived in New
Hmm.
York, and I looked out over the Hudson River, and I could see ice flows coming down the river. They got worse and worse every winter. There was more and more of it. I remember 1976. You could practically walk to New Jersey across the ice flows. And so during that time, lots of people were getting publicity, predicting, the end of the world or
Hmm.
global cooling, including Steve Schneider.
Hmm. Actually, Dr. Happer, I remember as a kid watching a documentary, I think it was by Leonard Nimoy, talking about the existential threat of global cooling,
Right.
the new ice
Yeah,
age,
yeah.
right?
Well, lots of
Hmm.
people believe. I think Steve Schneider was probably sincere,
Hmm.
and he did calculate the effects of CO2, hoping that CO2 might help. And so he didn't put any positive feedbacks in. He just took the direct calculation, which is
Hmm.
probably the right answer. And he pointed out that it wasn't enough to matter. It's so around a degree if you double CO2, a degree centigrade, the degrees they use in Canada. We still use Fahrenheit in the United
Okay,
States.
so I do have a question there. So when you refer to feedback, and I
Right.
should just clarify this for a sec. So the main contention is that carbon dioxide will lead to a degree or two of, or an increase in warming of the Earth
About one
over
degree
the next some 80 years,
not
right?
two, about one.
About one. Okay, sorry, I stand corrected. About 1 degree. Wow.
Yeah.
So then, but when you say frequency, do you mean like kind of a domino effect? Because of that 1 degree, all kinds of other things will happen,
Yes,
or
yes,
what?
that's feedback. Now, one thing most people don't recognize is that nature is full of feedbacks, and most natural feedbacks are negative, not positive. They try to prevent change, not accelerate change. It's called Le Chatelier's principle. It's well
Mhm.
known for a century or more. And somehow climate is supposed to be different, that the feedbacks in climate, not only are they not negative, but they're very strongly positive, which in itself is very unusual. I can't think of many systems like that. And there's no evidence, observational evidence, that it's even true. But nevertheless, they've been able to get away with the claims of these enormous positive feedbacks. So the innocuous warming that Steve Schneider first calculated, which was probably correct, has been turned into this threatening warming that's 3 times, 5 times. The sky's the limit.
Mhm.
Every year it seems
Mhm.
to get worse, and yet nature
Okay.
continues to point out that the right answer is probably that the feedback is as close to zero.
Okay. So there really isn't a existential threat. So the question then is, what do we do about it? Because the threat of the climate changing and creating an existential threat is being used as a pretext to change a lot of public policy. The list, it's like a laundry list of things that they're using on the pretext that this is all a threat to people's lives.
Yeah, I mean, it's being used by many people as a power grab. It's many people have pointed out it's quite similar to a secular religion, and religions at their best are wonderful things. They preach morality and make human existence better, but they're often corrupted, and they're simply used as control for people. And
Mhm.
so you promise, brimstone and fire, and unless you donate such and such to my church, and
Mhm.
so it's being used in that bad sense that
Mhm.
bad religions have used in the past. And
So in this context, though, when you look at actions in terms of lay people like myself trying to understand the complexities of climate science, we want to link or base public policy on good science. So what can we do in terms of action, and where is your hope in all of this?
well, I think the more we can educate the average citizen of Canada, United States, of the world for that matter, about the facts of climate and other science for that matter, the better off we will be. It will make them less susceptible to hucksters who who prey on their ignorance. So education would help, and that's a problem because the other side understands that, and they've turned much of elementary education into more propaganda than real education. So
Hmm.
it's
Yeah,
students learn that all the adults agree that this is the right answer, and so well, that's the right answer. And
yeah.
so
When we should be teaching them science, ironically.
yeah, that's right. So the poor students, they don't really learn what science is. That as we began this, that science is a truth that's outside of humanity. It's the way the world is, and it's complicated. There's a famous quotation by Einstein uh, when someone asked him about suppose suppose your theory of general relativity is wrong. They're going to test it at the next eclipse. This was 1919 or something. I think it was the Eddington expedition, but Einstein says, originally in German, but I'll try and translate it into English, well, the Lord God is subtle, but he's not malicious. And so what he was trying to say is that, the real realities of science, of the way the world works, gravity, everything, climate, COVID, is subtle. It's really hard to understand it. But if you keep working at it, honestly, you'll eventually understand it. You won't be tricked by nature or by God, whoever made the world the way it is. And so I think that getting the idea across that there really is this reality out there, that if you're honest about it, you can figure out what it is, and it'll be good for humanity. If you really know how the world works, you can work with it and make it work for you. But the way much of science is going now, it's like, like savage witch doctors. This is what the witch doctor tells you. All the witch doctors agree, and so that's what the truth is. But of course, that's not science at all.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Happer, for this very interesting discussion and for challenging all of us to not only be educated more about climate science, but also about this real debate and perhaps a solution in terms of how we can come forward as we care both about science and public policy. So thank you so much, Dr. Happer, for all your leadership and work in the area of science. We're so grateful that you could spend this time with us.
Thank you, David.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.